Mm-hmm.
You all are more than welcome to take pictures, but I do ask that you don't include flash. For some odd reason, they don't like to have the flash. It says that it's supposed to integrity of the building. If you don't mind stepping a little closer. This is the Andrew Johnson birthplace. Most would say it's a house, but it's not really a house. It's actually a kitchen. Andrew Johnson's mother was a housekeeper and cook for an inn called Castle's Inn that was located downtown. So since you all are here in town, and if you, I'm sure you've been down on Fayetteville Street, right across the street from the Wells Fargo building, there's a walking area and there's a marker that tells you this is where this building originally stood. So this building is over 220 years old. And Andrew Johnson was born in this building. His mother was a housekeeper and cook for that inn, as I said. They were extremely poor. If it had not been for the fact that the owner was nice enough to allow them to stay upstairs, they would not have had a place to live. That's how poor they were. And we do have a picture of what it looks like upstairs, because we don't take the public up there because of the age of the building. So this is what it looks like. This building has traveled all over the city of Raleigh before they brought it here in the early 80s. It was located over in Pullen Park, where it was open every day of the year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 and 366 days a year. People could come in and out as they wanted, and they almost destroyed the building. So the original flooring is over here. This is the upgraded version. And if you can see, the beams pretty much tells you the age of the building. Andrew Johnson did not go to school as a child because Raleigh during that time did not have a school system. They had academies, which meant you had to pay to attend those, and his mother could not afford to send he or his brother William to any of those academies. So what she did was she sent them to work as an apprentice for a man by the name of James Selby. Mr. Selby was a tailor, so Andrew and his brother William were trained to become tailors. And in fact, there were two other boys working for Mr. Selby. But out of the four boys, Andrew was the best tailor. In fact, he was a very good tailor. People actually knew his clothing. At one time, we had a coat that he had made on display, but our new curator had us to take it down. Next year, that coat would turn 200 years old. Now, the fact about being a tailor is that the tailors made their money from the clothing that they sold. So whatever money that they made from the clothing, that enabled them to go out and buy materials. So they had to be very meticulous about what they made. They couldn't have a coat with the sleeve correct and another sleeve out here because they wouldn't be able to sell it. So they had to make sure that whatever they did was as close to perfect as possible. And Andrew was one of those tailors. Even though he couldn't read and write, but he knew how to measure correctly and to make clothes. Even as president, he made his own clothing until he had a stroke. So therefore, after that, he was not able to make his clothing anymore. But people pretty much knew his clothing. You could say he was like your Tommy Hilfiger or your Perry Ellis or those clothes designers today. Mr. Selby treated them very badly because, in essence, they were supposed to work for Mr. Selby until they were 21 years old. And they ran away. So he, in a sense, owned them until they were 21. He put out a $10 reward. On June 24th, 1824, he put out this $10 reward because he wanted them back, where in essence he really wanted Andrew back, because Andrew, out of the four boys, was the very best that he had. Andrew and his brother William wandered around the state of North Carolina for a while. Andrew went to Greenville, Tennessee. And when he went to Greenville, Tennessee, he met a young woman by the name of Eliza McCardle, whom she taught him how to read and how to write. And they also married and had 5 children, 3 boys, 2 girls. The entertainment of the day was going to debates. And Andrew used to love to go to the debates to hear the people that were debating. And there was a man by the name of Thomas Brownlee who was considered one of the master debaters of that time. So Andrew challenged him to a debate. But Andrew wasn't a part of that debating circle. Mr. Brownlee didn't know who he was, so he pretty much blew Andrew off and said, yeah, okay, whatever. And Andrew kept asking. So finally, they chose a date, place, time. They had their debate. When it was time for Mr. Brownlee to give his rebuttal, he was literally silenced. Andrew gave a very eloquent rebuttal, and he won the debate. Mr. Brownlee got mad because, this man was a nobody as far as he was concerned, and he defeated him in front of all these people because he was a celebrity. And so wherever he was debating, people went to hear him debate. And here's this man that no one ever heard of defeating him in a debate. So Mr. Brownlee got mad and wanted to fight Andrew, but Andrew was like, it's only a debate. That's all it was. So when he went back to Greenville, and they were in the process of electing aldermen, people started going by Andrew's house saying, hey, you need to run as an alderman. He was like, you already have candidates, so I can't jump into the race now. And they're like, yeah, you can. And he said, no, but more and more people kept asking, so he went. So he finally decided, okay, I'll run. He won a seat on the Alderman Council. And in Greenville, they elected their mayor from the alderman. Andrew is now a member of the Alderman Council. They get ready to elect the mayor. They elect Andrew. So in one's minds, one can question, say, the fact that he grew up here, was not able to read and write, only a tailor, now he's mayor of a city. He ran for Congress, where he represented the 1st District of Tennessee for 4 consecutive terms. Each time he ran, he won each of his elections by a landslide. But in Washington, he wasn't very well liked. Andrew had a thing about the federal government. He didn't mind the federal government collecting taxes, but he had a serious problem with the federal government spending money. And he used to do many filibusters when they had these big issues that were up about governmental spending. So you would pretty much say he was against the wall right now. That's one of the big issues that we're having. That he would have been against the wall. One of the things I found most interesting about him was that the new federal government was realizing that they needed to do more toward education. So they had this idea of setting up a Department of Education. Andrew Johnson thought it was the craziest thing ever because that was going to be money spent. And me personally would think that when you reflect on where you came from, that you would be a supporter of the government setting up a Department of Education. That means more and more people can become educated. He thought that was wrong because the government was going to have to spend money for that. And so he turned a lot of people in Washington off. He went back to Tennessee as governor, and he was very successful as the governor of Tennessee. And when a Senate seat opened, he decided he wanted to go back to Washington as a senator. But he was part of that Jacksonian, Andrew Jackson branch of the Democrats. And Andrew Jackson was still alive, but he was pretty much near the end of his time in life and living. So he sent a group of people to pay Andrew Johnson a visit. And their visit, the purpose of their visit was to tell Andrew, don't run for that Senate seat. So Andrew said, okay, whatever. And so he decided he was going to run anyway. So Andrew Jackson sent another group of people over to talk to Andrew. And this time they said, you run for that seat, we will destroy you, where you will never do anything politically again. We will make sure of it. So Andrew said, sure, whatever. He ran anyway. But the thing about it is, the man that the Jacksonians had chosen was a man that Andrew had beaten previously for 4 of those congressional seats. I was like, why would you pick the same man? If he'd already beaten him 4 times for his congressional seat, why are you gonna pick this man to run against him for the Senate seat? So he goes back to Washington as a senator. And during this time there, the Civil War was beginning. Andrew Johnson was not a supporter of the Civil War, of the South succeeding the nation. In fact, he was labeled as a traitor. And he did everything he possibly could to keep the South from succeeding, but as we all know, the South did succeed. But he remained in Washington. He was the only Southerner and Democrat to remain in the Senate chamber. So had you seen the Senate chamber during that time, you would have seen the Republicans on one side, Andrew Johnson across the aisle, all by himself. So do you think that he got anything passed? No, because if he liked something, the Republicans said, well, we don't like that. Even if they did, they weren't going to vote for it because it was him. If he didn't like it, it's, oh yeah, we like it. Even if they didn't like it, but because it was him, they were going to do it. And they got very lax in what they were doing as well, too. And part of that was to throw Andrew Johnson off because he never missed a Senate session. He was always there. And it kind of irked a lot of the senators, the Republican senators, because they came whenever they wanted to come. And he was always sitting at his desk like, oh, hey, I thought we were meeting at 12 o'clock and it's 1:30. You late? I'm like, yeah, we are. But he was always there. Abraham Lincoln was running for his second term. He chose not to keep the gentleman that was his vice president from his first term. So he asked Andrew Johnson to run as his running mate. Now, most people would say that there is no way that you can have a Republican president and a Democrat for your vice president or vice versa. Well, actually, you could. If you all had the same platform that everyone agreed on, it could easily work. But, you know, at that time, it was either Democrat or Republican, pretty much like today. So, but they did not run as such. They ran as a completely neutral party. They ran as the unity party. And they won their election by a landslide. And 6 weeks after Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated for his second term, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, which no one expected. So the unthinkable was that Andrew Johnson would become the 17th president. On paper, Abraham Lincoln had a plan laid out that was almost flawless of how the nation should be reunited. But there were a lot of people that worked within the administration and cabinet members that did not like Andrew Johnson. In fact, one in particular was Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, who told him to his face, I do not like you, I have never liked you, I have no intentions of ever working with you. So Andrew was like, okay, that's fine. But there were several things that were going on in the South that the Union Army was doing. So Andrew would have to call him over, have a conversation with him. He's like, yeah, whatever. And Andrew got to that point where he realized that he was not going to be able to work with Mr. Stanton. So therefore, he drew up the Tenure of Office Act, which stated if the president is unhappy with a cabinet member's performance, he could remove that cabinet member. But the Senate said, no, you cannot. We all know that the Senate approved cabinet members. They also felt that they had the authority to remove cabinet members. So Andrew and the Senate had their round. So the Senate said, you know what, Andrew? We're going to impeach you. So he was the very first president in which the impeachment process was initiated. But he won by one vote. Edmund Ross from Kansas cast that deciding vote that kept Andrew Johnson as president. Had Andrew Johnson been impeached, the Speaker of the House, who was Thaddeus Stevens, would have become president. For some odd reason, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became president, they did not have a special election for vice president. And, you know, we on the staff here, when we have our discussions about Andrew Johnson, we've always wondered, why didn't they do that? But because at that time, between Andrew Johnson and Thaddeus Stevens, we could poll you all. So, well, which one do you dislike the most, Thaddeus or Andrew? And somebody would probably say, I don't like Thaddeus Stevens. I mean, I really don't like Andrew, but I'll take him. And I always joke and say that Edmund Ross probably did the best 3 out of 5 coin toss. And so he cast his vote for Andrew Johnson, who was a very lame duck, because as that process of impeachment was going on, the Senate usurped a lot of the presidential authority. And to make matters worse for Andrew, after he was, as he remained in office, he had a massive stroke and he was paralyzed. So he has to deal with reuniting the nation. He's got cabinet members and administrative members he can't trust and work with. It kind of sounds familiar today, right? And now he's trying to concentrate on his health. So he was near the end of his term, and he decided not to run for a term himself. But two things that are not associated, that most people don't associate with Andrew Johnson's presidency, is that the United States gained the Alaska Territory. Most people know it as Seward's Folly because no one knew what was there. When the reports came down that it was nothing there but ice and snow, people were like, why in the world would you pay $42,000 for a place that there's nothing there but ice and snow. Who's going to live there? Because they had not encountered the Eskimos. And then due to the fact that he had the stroke and was no longer able to sign his signature, a stamp pad was created for him to stamp his documents. Online with Frederick Douglass, one of the issues that we here at Mordecai don't go into a lot of detail about as far as slavery was concerned, that there was no plan B after the Emancipation Proclamation was written. It was just to free the slaves, yes, we know. But there was no plan B for what was going to happen with these freed slaves, especially after the Civil War. Yeah, the war was over, and you have all these freed slaves. They had no idea. The hope was, and Andrew Johnson, in a roundabout way, had hope that the slaves would go back to Africa. But the freed slaves, in essence, did not really have any close ties, because the majority of those places where those slaves had been captured from, in some instances, no longer existed. So had they gone back to Africa, the question was, well, where were they exactly going to? Now, we do know the United States did purchase Liberia. That was the hope, that they would all go back to Liberia and settle there, but that was not the case. So one would say, well, how would Andrew Johnson interact with Frederick Douglass? And I would tell you that it probably would not have been a very good conversation, because Andrew Johnson made a statement that said that even on his worst day, he was better than any slave on his worst day. And I personally laughed at that, because I said, even though you were white and you were free, but when you look at your conditions, you are not much better off than the slave. At least the slave, even though what their situation may have been, they did have a roof over their head. Slave captains, they may not have been the best in the world. They did have food to eat, may not have been the best in the world. They had clothing and shoes, may not have been the best in the world, but they did have those things. Compared to how he grew up, he did not readily have those. Now, I tell you, had it not been for the owner of Castle's Inn allowing them to stay here, they would not have had housing. That's how poor he was. So that's, and so in relation to Frederick Douglass, the relationship, they would have had very different attitudes toward the situation with slavery and with the emancipation of the slaves, because Andrew wanted them all to go back to Africa. Frederick Douglass most likely would not have agreed to that idea. Any questions and comments before we move on? Observations, any kind? Interjections, anyone? He did not. How many of you knew that Frederick Douglass was a minister? He was. In fact, he was an A.A. Zion minister. He was an ordained minister. And he started off using the church as a method to teach the slaves how to read and write. He disguised it as a religious service. He taught them how to read the Old Testament, until one of the slave owners found out what they were doing on Sundays and dispersed them from having dispersed their religious service, and they eventually kept them from having religious services on Sundays. But that's what he did. That's what he did. Questions, comments before we move?
So he was also against churches too, right? He turned against churches because a lot of churches, they were reluctant to turn against slavery. So he stopped going to all churches, right? So.
That I cannot speak of. I do know that he was an A.A. Zion minister. That would totally go against the fact that he'd been a little bit ordained minister if he would turn against churches. I would say, how could you be an ordained minister and turn against churches?
Yeah.
I could see you may have a problem with the order of the service and how the denomination is made with the turn against.
They're supposed to be, God will.
I could not readily address that. So I'll have to take it, but it kind of makes me wonder, it kind of is in conflict, don't you think?
Yeah, this is weird.
I don't think
That's
so.
just
Yeah, I don't think so much it is a conflict. I think if it's one of those things where you're not speaking against what's being done wrong to you, then why continue to speak it off at all? If he's using his services to educate the people and helping them to learn to read and write, then that to me kind of is more important.
It is.
Than kind of keeping people uplifted.
It is, and that was his purpose, because he did state that education was the key to freedom, which is, and that was what most slave owners feared the most.
Right.
Their thing was, if the slave know how to read and write, first thing they're going to want to do is become free.
Right.
And they did not want that at all. But as addressing his issue about turning against the church, I said I could not address that. The conflict with me is, if you're an ordained minister, how can you turn against the church if you're supposed to be representing the church as a minister?
Yeah.
That's my thing.
Yeah, and I don't object to him being a minister, but a lot of churches at that time, they were very reluctant to turn against slavery, to speak out against slavery. And so he stopped.
I would probably beg to differ. I would beg to differ with that. But due to time, that would
Agree to disagree.
But I will do research into that. And that might lead us to do and in Wake County on this original foundation. This house was built by Joel Lane, who is considered the father of Raleigh, because Joel Lane owned all the property, which is mostly of Wake County, some parts of Harnett and Johnson County. So he was a very land wealthy man. And so his son married Polly Hinton, and he built this house for them as a wedding present. It wasn't a very large house. It was from that end to that end. It was a half-story high. The original front door was where that window is. But 40 years later, they built this part of the house. Now, this house also is 7 years older than the city of Raleigh, because when this house was built, there was no Raleigh. North Carolina in its early history did not have a true capital city. The state legislature would travel between three cities: Hillsborough, Edenton, and New Bern. And North Carolina was not known at that time as the Great Road State. That was a nickname for state at that time, the Great Road State, because out of all the states in the nation, North Carolina was supposed to have the best roads in the nation. But prior to that, they only had paths, trails, and things of that nature to travel to and fro. So if it rained, snowed, a lot of mud, wagons can't pass through. So whenever they had their legislative sessions, whatever they had worked on from the previous legislative session probably didn't make it to the present one. And so they said, we need to find a new capital city. Joel Lane sold the state 1,000 acres, but they only built on 400. But between Joel Lane's plantation and his son Henry's plantation, they virtually surrounded the new city of Raleigh. So that meant whenever the state government wanted to expand, who did they have to go to buy land?
Joel Lane.
Henry or Joel. So they had a monopoly. But he built this house for them. So we're going to walk around and go into the east part of the house. They built this part of the house. And when it was completed in 1826, they painted it this color. To have exterior paint was another symbol of being very wealthy, because all paint was naturally made. Exterior paint had a little extra to it so it would last, because each time it rained, they couldn't come out and paint the house. Especially in the summer, they would constantly be out here painting. And even by the time they finished, it would rain again and wash it all off. So those are two symbols of being very wealthy. So we're gonna go to the east front of the house, or the west front of the house.
We're going inside the house?
Mm-hmm.
That 95% of everything that you see inside the house has been owned and used by members of the family. So you're looking at 234 years of artifacts in this house. So when anybody walking in on this one, I'm giving a tour, that means get a little physical. Originally, this was I had that to happen to me.
Oh no.
I didn't lock the door. It scared me because the man walked up on me. I was like, You have to pace there. This is an open porch originally. And if you notice, the floor slants down, so when the rain would come down, it would wash out. Then when they did enclose it, they used a cheap plywood type deal. This is the nursery. I'll do the time, just take a look at it. The women that took care of the children would come from their slave quarters, which was actually about, the slave quarters originally were located about 2.5 blocks down in that direction. And so the women would come up and they would enter in and they would go in here. They were not allowed to wander throughout the house. They would take care of the children, and whenever they would leave at night or whenever, they would exit. You'll see a tub in there. The tub was used by the family from 1785 up until 1914. In 1914, they installed plumbing, but the slaves would have to go bring the water. And if you notice, as you were walking up, you saw a sign that said Mordecai Springs. There was a spring that used to run through, and they had a structure there, and that was used as their refrigerator, where they would keep the eggs, the milk, the butter, the cheese, and the ice cream that they made on occasions. And whenever they needed to get milk and stuff, they would go over, and also the water. In the late 60s, they shut off the spring, they tore down the structure, but the foundation is still there. So for you wandered around here, at times you probably walked them, you saw this foundation over there. That was originally the spring house. So they made lye soap. They didn't throw anything away here. All the ashes from the fireplace they kept. When they killed their pigs and the hogs, the excess fat they kept, and they would mix it with a chemical and they would make lye soap. So lye soap is made from pig's fat, ashes, and a chemical. It's not very kind to the skin. In fact, over a period of time, it eats through your skin. So they only really completely bathe once a week. I would say on Saturday, because they went to mass on Sunday. And at one time, 15 people lived in this house. And so the baby was always last. So the statement, don't throw the baby out with the bath water, comes with that. So the slaves would bring in the water. But the person that benefited from the bath the most was the very first person, because they would get in, bathe, they would get out, the next person would get in. They did not change the bath water, ladies and gentlemen. So I said, a family that bathes like that together, you must love that person, right? Because if you're number 8, you got to love 7 on up and hope that they weren't too dirty. The slaves that served the food would come in this way. They would ring the bell, they would come in from the kitchen, they would enter into the dining room, serve the food, exit out. They were not allowed to stay inside the house. So the slaves were constantly in and out of the house, especially if they had big dinners, bringing stuff from the kitchen. We did not see the kitchen due to time. But if you all ever come back for a tour, we make sure you will see that. As I was telling the young ladies walking up, we do a lot of free stuff here. Every first Saturday of every month, we do a living history where we have people come and do different things. We have a gentleman that cooks. All of his recipes are from the 17 and 1800s. He does cook with fat back, lard, ham hock, all of that. So for those of you who may have been accustomed to eating that way, that's how he cooks. And he tells people, if you have high blood pressure, you're watching your diet or diabetes, you may not want to taste the food. It's all from scratch. And I will tell you, it's very delicious. From 1785 up until 1964, members of the family lived in this house. So 5 generations lived in this house. Henry was an attorney, so that is his desk over there. I do encourage you all to go over to the Joel Lane house, because Joel Lane actually is the beginning. And if you go visit the Joel Lane's house, you will see a desk just like that at the Joel Lane house. If you recall in the Andrew Johnson house, the ladder, they would have had something very similar to go up to the loft. This staircase was not installed in the house until 1826. From 1785 up until 1826, they lived in this space, and the little loft upstairs. This did not exist until 1825, 1826. Even though they were a very wealthy family, they lived very modestly. And we, the staff, have questioned, with all the money they had and property, they only had these basically 3 rooms to live out of. And at one time, 10 people lived in this house. Henry and his wife Polly had 5 children, but only 4 survived. Their son, whose name we do not know, died shortly after being born, but his 4 daughters, Margaret, Harriet, and Nancy, Margaret, Harriet, Temperance, and Nancy survived. Margaret married Moses Mordecai in 1818, so they're actually celebrating, 1817, they're actually celebrating their 202nd wedding anniversary. So the day that Margaret married Moses Mordecai, the house no longer was known as the Lane house. It became the Mordecai house. So for 202 years, this house has been known as the Mordecai house. Because when Margaret said, "I do," he put that ring on her finger. Everything that she owned became Moses's. Moses was Jewish. So in a sense, he married up. Even though he was a prominent attorney, he's the first recognized Jewish attorney in North Carolina history. And he did very well for himself. But when he married Margaret, he was marrying into what you would consider the first family of Raleigh. Why? Her grandfather owned all of this. So for her, ladies, she only got a husband, really, basically. He got a plantation, over 1,200 acres, 122 slaves, and a nice house. They had 3 children, Henry, Ellen, and Jacob. This is Moses' father, Jacob. He did not approve of Moses marrying Margaret. In fact, he told Moses, if you marry her, I will disown you. But the trick to the question of that is, Moses was 33 years old when he married Margaret. It wasn't that he was asking his father for permission to marry. It was more of an announcement. I'm getting married. Come to my wedding. He did not come. He told Moses' brothers and sisters, have nothing else to do with them. As far as I'm concerned, he's dead to all of us. Margaret, on the other hand, was 28 years old. In the 17 and 1800s, women, well, way before that, women married as early as 12. And they usually married older men. So it was nothing uncommon for a young woman to be in her late teens, early 20s, mid 20s, close to 30, to have been married twice, if not 3 times. But to marry for the very first time, close to 30, they were like, what's wrong with you? All these men and you just now marrying for the first time? So of course she had some catching up to do. So she had 3 children back to back. She had the last child she had with Moses. He named after his father Jacob, and Margaret died. Moses waited 2 years and he married her younger sister Nancy. It was not uncommon for men to marry their sister-in-laws when their wives would die. So ladies, you would hope that your sister was very ugly or she was getting married right away, because if you died, your husband was going to marry her. And that was the common practice at that time. So Moses and Nancy had a little girl. They named her Margaret. Shortly after the baby Margaret was born, Moses died of malaria. So he has now 3 children, Henry, Ellen, and Jacob, without any living parents. And he has this newborn. Well, one of Moses' brothers did come here to live, and his name was George Washington. So he took over the plantation, and they built this part of the house. We're just going to see it, then we're going to go upstairs and talk about that, then we're going to leave. We got a nice dining room. I'm going to let you all take a look at the dining room.
And can we, so for our purposes, we're really interested in how people who were enslaved here were living. Could you mention both the bell and then also how food maybe was served? Okay. You guys can walk in. Go ahead.
Is that what you're saying, George Washington, like the president?
No. No. Can you guys come this way, please? We're gonna come over there next. Thank you.
Is this everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. When food was served, they would ring the bell. The slaves would come in from the kitchen through this door, carrying that tray. One slave would be on one side, another slave would be on the other. They would serve the food, and they would exit out. They were not allowed to stay inside the house. As I told you, whatever they needed, they would ring the bell. Slaves would come in and out to serve whatever they needed to serve. Moses and Margaret did go on a shopping spree because their hope was to build themselves a house on the property. It's not like they lacked property, they had plenty of it. So the china that you see here on the table back there comes from Canton, China. It's the real thing. The chandelier is a replica of the original chandelier. The original chandelier is in the Museum of Washington, D.C. They would have used candles, of course. The glassware comes from England and France. The silver comes from England. The table comes from England. This sofa comes from England. The silver pictures. One of the women here, there's a connection between her and her slave, because her slave was the person that took care of making sure the silver looked nice. And her name was, got a little note card here, was Mary Walker. No. Yes. And she had written to Frederick Douglass to help her get her children. She was not very successful, but we do know that she was a slave here and that she had written to Frederick Douglass in the hopes of getting her children, because, as we know, children were separated from their parents. In fact, Andrew, we do know that Frederick Douglass was also separated from his mother. That was a practice in some of the plantations in Maryland. So he pretty much could identify with her wanting her children back. As far as food preparation, the kitchen, which I did not show, was for the house only. So the slave thing, we do know that there were 4 women that were the primary cooks for the family. All the meals were sit-down meals. They were in the kitchen from 4 a.m. up until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, cooking 7 days a week. Breakfast was served every morning at 6 a.m. And Ellen Mordecai, who has written a book that kind of gives us some idea of what life on this plantation was like, said breakfast was served every morning at 6 a.m. Everyone had to be at the table when the bell sounded and dressed. That included the children. You did not come downstairs in a nightgown, pajamas, or after they sounded the bell, you decided, oh, well, I'll come down at 6:30. You didn't eat. You didn't eat. And that bell sounded, you needed, even on the grounds for lunch and dinner. If you were anywhere around the house, and they used a system of bells to communicate because of the vastness of the plantation, it extended as far south as where the governor's mansion is, as far north as where Crabtree Creek is, as far east as where St. Augustine's University is, and as far west as where Peace and St. Mary's Streets are. So that's a pretty large piece of property, don't you think? So they couldn't go out here and holler if the slave was over there, what is now Broad High School. Would they hear him? No. So they used bells. I like to consider this the ancestor of the microwave, because you put this cabinet directly in front of the fire. The heat from the fire will heat the cabinet. The only thing we did was just put the plate inside. You never really ate anything cold. And most of the food that was prepared was kept in cast iron, so it was always kept very warm, if not pretty much hot. But this is what they had. So they would just put the plate in. When the plate got heated, they would put the food in, and of course the food was already warm, and more heat from the plate would give you a hot meal. Any questions and comments? If there's anything that I'm missing, please help me out, because my regular tour in Frederick Douglass is kind of a little different, so I'm grasping here. Okay? So if there's anything, please.
Yes, so,
yes, sir.
how do they get all the land?
How do they get the land?
Yeah, or like, what do they like use it for?
This was a corn plantation, ladies and gentlemen. When people think of plantations in the South, what comes to your mind?
Cotton, tobacco.
Tobacco. Unless you're along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, where they grew rice,
Sugar.
and Gulf Coast sugar cane, and Georgia and South and parts of Florida, indigo. But they grew corn here. They grew some cotton. Very, very, very little cotton here. No tobacco at all. When I came here to work, I was like, wow, really? Corn? I never thought of a corn plantation. And they had pretty much everything that you could want. They had a Cooper. Does anybody know what a Cooper is? And I'm not talking about the little car. They had a Cooper. You know what a Cooper is? They make bells. They had a cobbler. I tell school kids, not apple, cherry, peach, cobbler, make shoes. They had a blacksmith. They had a mill to refine the corn. They had breastworks on the grounds. They had a seamstress and a tailor, of course. They pretty much had everything that you could need, and what they did not have, they had the money to purchase it.
Were all the artisans enslaved people?
Yes.
Okay.
We do know that they did not particularly go for free.
Gotcha.
People. They didn't. In fact, family still, the Mordecai still live in Raleigh, and other family members, because there are a vast number of them. And when I first started working here, our director we had at that time said, be very careful, because they used to show up unannounced. And they had an issue when we talked about slaves, because they thought that we should address them as servants. And I said, there's a difference between a servant and a slave. So they were really, they really got sticky with, and then they would always call her and say, well, why are you still talking about slaves? Because it was a pun.
Yeah.
Let's be real. And in Ellen's book, the way she describes the ground, they had ponds here, also some trees, berry patches, nut trees, fruit trees, all sorts of fowl, animals, and ponds with fishing and all that. And the way she describes it, unless you didn't look at it for what it was, well, that sounds like a really nice place to live. I mean, I read the book in 2 days. I read it, in fact, I read it twice because I really wanted to grasp what I was reading, because when I first said, well, I saw it, then I had to realize this is a plantation. It wasn't fun.
Right.
It was for her.
Well, of course, of course. And we do know that Henry is, and that is Henry, the oldest son of Moses and Margaret. How much detail can I go into?
You can go into all the detail.
Do you all need to leave?
Come all the way in.
You all need to leave? Okay. Henry, this is Henry, the oldest son of Moses and Margaret. And Henry was not a very pleasant slave owner. In fact, his uncle George Washington gave him little responsibilities as he was growing up to make him a good slave owner, if there's such a thing as a good slave owner. Is there such a thing as a good slave owner? Could anyone say there's such a good thing? Okay. That's what Henry looked like. So when Henry finally got the property in tow, he kicked everybody out. His aunts, his brother, his sister, his uncle George Washington, he showed them the door. And Henry was a very successful businessman. He was also an attorney. He was a very successful businessman, but he used unscrupulous gains to get his money. In fact, he preferred his, as he referred to some of the slave women that were lighter skinned, the high yellow ones, and he would prostitute them out to bring in money. We do know that. Frederick Douglass would not have approved of that. That's why I say he and Frederick Douglass would not have been very good friends at all. He took the true meaning of being a slave owner to its fullest. And whatever you want to take that as, that's what he did. In fact, with our slave narratives, over in the Business Center, we have the slave narratives. We used to have the book of the slave narratives. We don't have that in print anymore. Hopefully, with a few of the slaves that were here, they talk about him. They said he was a very cruel man. They did not like him. Even one of the older women said that even as a child, she did not like him as a child, and he did not change. So whatever it took to bring him the dollar, that's what he did to bring in the dollar. He married his mother's cousin. He was 26, she was 15. They had 4 children, but his son Moses, that he named after his father, died. The only thing we know is he got wet, he caught a fever, he died within 4 days. But his 3 daughters, Margaret, Mary, and Miss Patty, survived. That's Margaret, his oldest daughter as a girl. That's Margaret as his granddaughter. We have a lot of Margarets, Rachel, and Ellens in this family. They love that name. He purchased this piano for his wife in 1857. They built pianos just like this in Baltimore, Maryland. It only has 80 keys, made out of real ivory. When we have our holiday open house, we have someone that comes and plays Christmas carols. This chandelier isn't original. It was hung in the house in 1872. It was a gas chandelier. It's made out of brass. Again, you see the books. I did touch on the books. There are 1,568 books in this house. and they have been read by members of the family. They're not props. As I told you outside, 95% of everything you see in this house has been owned and used by members of the family. Questions and comments, and we'll move upstairs.
I do have two.
Yes.
So a couple of the stories that I've heard about Henry, so you talked about his son. I heard a story that the enslaved woman who was caring for the son at the time that he fell in the water,
Yes.
that he murdered her, he killed her.
That's what they say.
Okay. And then the other story that I heard was, you talked about the yellow women, that there was actually a house on the property called the Yellow House where he kept them and
Yeah, that's where the people
had
would
his
go.
way
Yeah.
with the women
Yeah.
there.
That's where they would go. Yeah.
Okay.
It was his good time house.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Questions? Well, that's what it was.
So, I guess to kind of keep it true to history,
Yes.
when you all have the events that come, are they the people that come, are they black?
Some do. In fact, last was it June or July? One of the slave descendant families came here to have a family reunion. Maggie Curtis. In fact, she was a slave here, and they had their family reunion here. And
I
WRL.
saw her on the wall.
Yes. In fact, in March, we're doing a matriarch of Mordecai's, and she's one of the featured persons when we do, yes, and that's going to be March 15th. Friend us on Facebook. They tell you everything we do. I think it's March 15th, and in fact, her great-great-grandson, I know him personally, is coming here tomorrow. We're interviewing him because he's going to give us some additional information about Megan Curtis.
That's great.
Originally, this was the loft. From where I'm standing to the door is how wide it was, and the ceiling came right here. So with the extreme home makeover of 1825, 1826, they raised the ceiling, they kind of opened up a little bit. And in Ellen's book, she talks about this room. It's her favorite room in the whole house. She used to love to spend time here as a girl. You notice some of the original panes are still in the windows. We do have those. This bed belonged to Moses and Margaret. This was their bed. So this bed is 202 years old. It is a rope bed. So the term good night, sleep tight comes from the rope bed because they didn't have box springs. They had rope. So if the rope is loosened, your mattress has a tendency to sink. And we know that most mattresses at that time were made out of chicken feathers, goose down, or straw. If it was made out of straw, that meant when they went to the field, they just shoved stuff in the bag, sewed it up, threw it on the bed. You found out that night, early morning, what was in your mattress. Which it could have been a rat, snake, turtle, all sorts of bugs, whatever. So from this, you get good night, sleep tight from the rope. Don't let the bed bugs bite from the straw mattress. If you notice, there are no closets because they did not install closets in the house. They had armoires or wardrobes, they had dressers, trunks, chests to store their belongings. That's how they stored things. This nursing gown did belong to Ellen. That's how tall she was as an adult. She was rather petite. She, like her mother, married late. She too was 28 years old when she married. She married her father's cousin, so her name was Ellen Mordecai. They weren't married very long, a little over 2 years. They married, had their first child, they moved to Mobile, Alabama, but shortly after they got there, her husband contracted malaria and died. Henry was nice enough to let her come back here to stay for a little bit. She built a house behind the governor's mansion on East Lane Street. But in her book, she says Henry used to say to her, I'm going to talk to your builder. It's taking him a long time to build that house. Or, why is it taking that man so long to build your house? How much are you paying him to build? What kind of house are you building? So she said that her last night in the house, she said she was very grateful that her brother allowed her to come and stay in the house. But she was kind of getting tired of his comments, and she was looking forward to having her own home where she could do things the way she wanted. Which kind of let you know that she was ready to become truly independent because she never remarried after that. But the fact that her husband, if I did say, was 7 years younger than she, which was scandalous. Women did not marry younger men. And she was 28, he had just turned 21. So that was quite scandalous at that time. Questions, comments? That's what Moses' brother looked like. That's George Washington, his brother. He was 56 in that portrait. He married Mary Cameron, so if you're familiar with Raleigh, Cameron Village is her family owned that property for this Cameron Village. Let's step across, take a look at 2 rooms, and we'll be finished.
I'm sorry, I was just gonna ask a quick question.
Yes.
So, did Ellen did she have a playmate who was an enslaved girl?
Yes, her
Okay.
name was
Emily?
Yes, and she married a man that, he was a freedman.
Okay.
And he married her and took her off the plantation, and she did not approve of that marriage.
Oh, Ellen didn't?
did not approve of that marriage, but it was pretty much at that point where the woman was pretty much close to being where she was. She was pretty much freed, or close. It was near that time where she really didn't have to have permission.
Okay.
And Ellen did not approve of them, and they pretty much broke ties because the man whom she married was kind of say, well, you're through there. Your time is up, so you don't have to communicate with them. But this was a bathroom. This is a bathroom.
What are the main genres of those?
All of the literature of that time period. We associate this room with Mary. This is Henry's second daughter. That's her portrait there. And this is her husband, William Turk. So if you, right there by the Department of Revenue, Wilmington Street, there's a marker that talks about the Raleigh and Gaston Railroad. He was the CEO of that railroad, and he married Mary. In fact, there's a sketch of him as a boy. The original picture is on the mantle, and there's a charcoal sketch of him as a boy. School kids have a tendency not to like that sketch. This bed belonged to Henry and Polly Lane, so we know this too is a rope bed. This 3-sided cradle was created in the late 1820s, so if the baby cried, the mother could just roll over and take care of the baby. In relation to Frederick Douglass, we do know that when Moses Mordecai was questioned, and he was questioned quite a bit by him being Jewish, why do you have slaves given what Jews have gone through? He took a neutral approach, and his answer was always, it's the institution I married into. That was his response. So when people further questioned him, you can still free the slaves. And his response was, it's not as easy as you think. So that was his thing. He pretty much, yes, I'm on the plantation, but yet I don't do too much with it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So he pretty much said, yeah, I know. That's what they have. This is who I married.
Right.
But I don't do much with it. But he was very careful about the overseers that he brought here, because we know that most overseers were extremely cruel to the slaves. They would beat the slaves to an inch of their lives. They didn't care. They worked them halfway to death. But we do know that Moses was very, even though he removed himself, but he was aware. It was not he was completely in the dark. He knew what was going on. We do know that. We know that quite a bit. But when being pressed about the issue of having slaves, he kind of brushed that to the side. Now, I would ask you all, how would Frederick Douglass handle that situation? Could you say you can't have slaves? You can't have slaves and can't have slaves? Does that? I used to ask my students questions like, they're like, what? Well, can you or can't you? You can't have slaves and not have slaves?
Yeah, it was a sign of the era.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, one of the states was a sign of aristocracy. You know, even so, you know, so a lot of folks say Abraham Lincoln, despite the fact that he freed slaves, a lot of people say Abraham Lincoln was a racist. Some people still categorize him as that, because of the fact that he was.
Well, you also know part of his genealogy, as far as people don't talk about his genealogy.
Yeah. Well, even from a kid, you know, his father had him working in the fields, and so that, you know, growing up, you know, he realized that, you know, for somebody to work out in the field for free, you know, was not right. You know, and so, you know, because you know, he was in it, and because of the fact that he knew it was very hard to reach the Emancipation Proclamation, he, you know, along with many others, they wanted to send them to, like you said, Liberia, during the Republic, Brazil, Haiti, you know, but
the thing about it, though, if they had sent them to Brazil and Haiti, well, Haiti would have been completely freed up. But, you know, the United States did not have much to do with Haiti.
Yeah.
That was completely something, that was one of the things that they would not. Brazil, why would you free them and send them back to slavery? Because
They were just getting rid of them.
they're trying to get, they're trying to get them sort of like their own island.
Yeah.
I get that, we know. But in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I don't think it's a point where they're kind of doing them a favor, if you will. It's more so like, well, we freed them, can't really do anything with them here, send them back to.
The worst thing they did, and I have to, and people say, well, explain yourself. They were not educated.
Right.
Most of the slaves had never been off a plantation.
Right.
And we do know that the Union Army, when they usually came to for those plantations that they burned down, they literally forced the slaves to leave. And if they did not leave, and there were some cases where they literally shot them.
Yeah, shot and killed them.
So you have this people who know really nothing about the world except for what they've been accustomed to. Now all of a sudden you're flinging them out.
Yeah.
What justice is that for them?
It isn't any, but to that point, it also kind of just furthers the industry. Well, you can't go anywhere else, so you might as well just stay here and keep doing what you were doing as an indentured servant or.
That's why, exactly, you were thinking, and that's why they were so readily to say, well, come on back and share. But even with that, there was a lot of abuse.
Still.
There was a lot of abuse.
Just because you're, you know, the paperwork says you're free doesn't mean you're free.
And you know, I talked about Henry, the son who owned the plantation. His wife, Martha Hinton, who was 15 when he married her at age 26. And we also joke and say that was actually a mercy. That was a mercy wedding. You all, Jim, you know what a mercy wedding is?
For her or for him?
I would say for her. Do you all know what a mercy women do? They know what a mercy wedding is. You know what a mercy wedding is?
No.
You really don't want that person, but it's a situation where you got to get married.
Oh.
So you just got, you know, you can't love the one you want, love the one you with, that type deal.
Oh.
And that's kind of how that was.
Yeah.
Because Henry had a lot of deficiencies.
Okay.
He had gotten sick and he caught a fever. And from that point on, when he recovered, he had a limp. Well, actually, he pretty much dragged. So, of course, that kind of made him a little unattractive. And then his attitude.
Yeah.
Not too many people wanted that. So you have this young girl, she's a cousin. And it's like, well, we need to get you married. We have someone. So she really couldn't say no. So she stuck with this man.
Yeah.
But my point is, this is the comment that she made with the end of slavery. She said they wanted freedom, now they would truly get to taste what freedom is. And she said it jokingly, meaning they won't be free very long. Because we do know that some of those former slaves did come back here to work as sharecroppers.
Yeah.
But just the fact that she made
they wouldn't
that
be able,
comment.
basically they wouldn't be able to handle it.
But they couldn't.
Or they couldn't afford it, you know.
But they couldn't because no one was hiring them.
Yeah.
You can't read, you can't write, really, honestly.
What can you do for me?
You can't really do anything. We only do what you know. And if that was in the fields, if that's what you know, that's what you know.
Yep.
And then again, like I said, with most of those plantations that were destroyed, crops and everything, because Sherman's army did it. You know what he did, George? His trail. And he would have done it here in Raleigh, which he did not do. He did not. Raleigh was spared of all the southern cities that he made his march through. He did not do anything here. Raleigh was very fortunate, if you want to call it that. And in fact, he occupied this house. The Union Army occupied this house. Henry and his uncle George Washington left the family, the women, and hid out in Fayetteville for 5 months. George Washington was the president of the Bank of Raleigh. When the Union Army came, he took all the money out of the bank, which was Confederate currency, which I think is so funny, it had no value, but they didn't know that. And he and Henry went and hid out, and they left the women here. So the Union Army, when they came to Raleigh, came here. They stayed in this house. The Mordecai women had to wait on them hand and foot, which they did not like. And this Union Army was encamped on the grounds here.
So we didn't do
Businesswoman. She knew how to make money, but she knew how to do it right. She was also a very influential woman. It is stated that when a governor was elected, 2 things happened. Well, actually 3. But the 2 main things was, if she liked the governor, she invited him to lunch. If she was a strong supporter, she invited him to dinner. If she didn't like the governor, he didn't give an invitation at all. And that governor normally did not have a good term in office. During the Great Depression, when people were losing money, Miss Patty was making money. She was laughing all the way to the bank. You know why? Because she invested in 2 big companies, electrical companies. She hated electricity. She hated it with a passion. In fact, she would not, as long as she was alive, she did not allow electricity to come in this house. She preferred her beeswax candles, and they had a beehive here specifically to make the wax to make her candles. Then when she died, of course, they brought in electricity. Second thing was, she never smoked a day in her life. But who did she invest in?
Philip Morris.
R.J. Reynolds. She knew it had a future. Just like with the electricity. She didn't like it, but she knew it had a future. So she invested, because what? People smoked. What men smoked. People were using electricity, right? It was something new. So she said, that's a moneymaker. And plus she sold the property because it was no longer a plantation. Raleigh was growing, businesses coming in, people moving in. And she knew that they need places to build. Sell land. So she made money. Never married. Never married. That's her nephew, Burke Little. This is his father, Dr. William Little. I talked about him downstairs. He married her older sister, Margaret. He was the primary surgeon over at Peace. He was one of the leading physicians with the Confederate Army. And so he was over at Peace University as the primary physician there. So most of the surgeries that they did, as we stated, were amputations, because that's what they did. They didn't have a lot of time to go in. So that's her nephew. He's dressed up as Little Lord Fauntleroy. So he is the very last family member. Miss Patty is the very last Mordecai to live in this house. And she lived in this house until 1949. She was 89 years old when she died. Burke lived in this house until 1964. He was the very last person. And he is the one that sold the property, this property, to the city of Raleigh before he died. Other than that, this house most likely would have been torn down. In the late 60s, early 70s, Raleigh went through and tore down a lot of post-Victorian houses and buildings. There's a book that we have of what Raleigh looked like in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and the early 60s. Beautiful. Hillsborough Street looks nothing like it. It was tree-lined streets, beautiful Victorian houses and built. It was gorgeous. And they went through and they tore all that stuff down. Oakwood up the street, they were supposed to build a freeway. The business class lived there. You affluent doctors, attorneys, business owners lived there. And they wanted to build a freeway through there. Those people banded together and fought the city. That's why that area is very strict in living. All those houses that are there, I said it looks like an Easter egg hunt that blew up there. Those people can't do anything unless the city says okay. They can't add anything to their homes. They can't take anything away from their homes. They really can't even change the color of their house. Most of you are probably new here because at one time Peace University was an all-women's school. So up until what, 5, 7 years ago?
It was 6 years ago.
6 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so you may have been here. I think this is the third year. A couple bought property over in Oakwood to build a house. $900,000 house. They presented everything to the city council. They said, fine, build your house. The week they were supposed to move in, if you were here and you recall, the city says, oh, we're sorry. You can't move into your house. And the husband was like, what? They had him on the news. That man was very restrained. He was beyond living. And I'm sure he wanted to say some words. Yeah. They would have bleeped out his whole comment, but he was very restrained. Because his thing was, we went through everything. We had our builder, the contractor, everything that we needed to build our home, and you said yes. And the week we're moving in, you tell us we can't move in.
Why couldn't they move in?
But the city said it did not meet the historical quality. But when they went through everything, they said fine. Yeah. There were two things that we do know of. First of all, the property where they were building their home had never had a historic, if you will, structure there, because that would have been a thing that said, no, you can't. So that was one thing. And the other thing was, even the house is not, it's kind of on the far eastern part of Oakwood. So it's not really where all those nice historic houses are per se. I mean, it's in the neighborhood, but it's not like side by side. So they said, well, fine. I mean, the land's not being used and the structure is not going to really take away, so sure. But then to come up and tell them the week you're moving in, I don't think anybody, none of us in this room would go well with that. You done spent $900,000, a little bit more because you got the furniture. And then you got trucks out there trying to move stuff in and you gonna tell me I can't move in? So whenever they won, Burke pretty much felt that they would probably start looking here to move down. We can't have you, we'll move down. But the house was falling apart. By this time, Burke was confined to a wheelchair and bedridden. So the ramp that's out there was really placed there for him to get in and out of the house. So this was back in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. The house is falling apart. I mean, this house was completely in disrepair. Even though he was well off, but he did not have the amount of money to really bring the house up to standard. Family used to come here and stay for free as long as they wanted. And he asked them, will you help me with it? And they said, it's your house, you take care of it. He had round-the-clock care. He would send them up to see what was going on. They said there's holes in the roof. When it rained, it was raining. They would come up trying to mop up everything. Holes in the wall, mold, mildew, all of that. Someone from the Raleigh Historic Society knew the family, knew the history, and they saw what was going on, and they wanted to save this house. And then they, in turn, got someone involved from the city of Raleigh, a lot of negotiation. So in 1964, they came to an agreement, and they purchased this property for $60,000. Even though Burke promised Miss Patty he would never sell it, because before she signed that will for him to get this, she made him promise. And he, of course, he said he wouldn't, but due to those circumstances, he sold it. That would have been used to make the meal. We used to have a churn out here because they made their own butter. You saw the wash tub in there, where it was a multi-purpose tub. Not only did it wash clothes, but it was used for bathing and washing dishes and stuff like that. And so, you know, we have a popcorn popper over there. We have several of those.